Egypt is the gift of the Nile. That's what Herodotus, the father of history, said. Since the Nile is the lifeline, as it provided Egypt with water for the cultivation of crops, which led to the burgeoning of civilization all along the length of the Nile Valley. The river strip that divided the Egyptian territory into two parts provided a favorable environment for the rise of civilization when the Nile Valley began in the Miocene times, cutting it into its current shape. The various geographical resources effectively contributed to the state's foundation. As a result of the annual floods that spread the fertile soil to the east and west over the centuries, mud deposits built up. When the water recedes and flows along its banks, the agricultural year begins, making Egypt one of the first agricultural communities that ever existed in human history. It's known Apepi. Apepi was also known as Apophis and had an Egyptian name related to the giant snake Apophis or Apep, the sun god Ra's nemesis. At the same time the Hyksos rose to prominence in northern Egypt, the Nubians rose to power in the south. The Middle Kingdom's 13th dynasty, like Lower Egypt's, had forgotten to pay attention to its southern frontier. Thebes remained Upper Egypt's capital, but instead of dominating the entire nation, it was wedged between the Hyksos in the north and the Nubians in the south. According to Manetho, Apepi of the Hyksos wrote to the Theban king Seqenenrunta 1580 BCE, "Do away with the hippopotamus pool to the east of the city, for it prevents me from sleeping day and night." The message was most likely about the Theban practice of hippopotamus hunting, which would have been insulting to the Hyksos, who worshipped Set and included the hippo in their religious observances. Tao, rather than complying with the request, saw it as a challenge to his autonomy and marched on Avaris. His mummy indicates that he was slain in battle, and this, together with the events that follow, reveals that the Thebans were vanquished in this fight. Tao's son Chamos took up the cause, lamenting bitterly in an inscription about having to pay the Asiatics' taxes. The early dynastic period in Egypt began in the years 3150 to 2613 BCE. This marks the beginning of the country's historical era in which Upper Egypt, the south, and Lower Egypt to the north were unified as one country under centralized authority. During this time, the divine rule of the monarch started, and a distinct Egyptian culture emerged, including the development of writing, arts, and sciences. Menes, the first king of Egypt, was a ruler of Upper Egypt, presumably from Thinis or Hierakonpolis, who defeated the other city-states around him before conquering Lower Egypt around 3150 BCE. Narmer married the princess Neithotep of Nakata in an arrangement to enhance the links between the two towns. He undertook military operations and religious observances. Tao, rather than complying with the request, saw it as a challenge to his autonomy and marched on Avaris. His mummy indicates that he was slain in battle, and this, together with the events that follow, reveals that the Thebans were vanquished in this fight. Tao's son Chamos took up the cause, lamenting bitterly in an inscription about having to pay the Asiatics' taxes and dealing with outsiders to the north and south of him and his kingdom. He launched a huge attack on the Hyksos, destroying Avaris according to the narrative. Chamos reports that his attack was so fast and scary that it rendered the Hyksos women barren, and that he destroyed the city to the ground following the carnage. This tale appears to be exaggerated, as the Hyksos retained control of Lower Egypt 3 years after Chamos' invasion, and Avaris remained the Hyksos' stronghold. The hieroglyphic alphabet, which was invented around 3400 to 3200 BCE, was used for maintaining records, although no entire sentences from this period have been discovered. At this time, the earliest Egyptian writing discovered so far originates from Abydos, and was discovered on pottery, clay seal imprints, and bone and ivory items. Complete sentences are not found in Egypt until the time of King Peribsen in the 2nd dynasty 500 years later. This period led to the Naqada III period from 3200 to 3150 BCE. Following Naqada III, the early dynastic period and Egypt's recorded history began. With commerce, communities expanded and flourished, and the populations of both Lower and Upper Egypt increased. Small villages of brick dwellings and buildings evolved into bigger urban centers that soon clashed. Culture and art. The houses were built of sun-baked brick, and the more opulent ones included courtyards, an addition that would become commonplace in Egyptian homes later. The city of Abydos, located north of Naqada, became an important burial location, and huge tombs were built, forming a necropolis, a city of the dead. These tombs were originally made of mud bricks, but subsequently of huge, neatly hewn limestone. Eventually, the site would become the burial place for Egypt's rulers. Despite this, evidence reveals that individuals from all across the nation had their deceased buried at Abydos, and gave burial gifts to commemorate their memory. By this time, the cities of Zeus and Hierakonpolis were considered ancient, while Thinis, Naqada, and Nekhen were rapidly developing. The hieroglyphic alphabet, which was invented around 3400 to 3200 BCE, was used for maintaining records. Insurgency. The dynasty ended with the Ka's reign, during which his heirs struggled for the throne and were defeated by Hotep II, who established the Second Dynasty. Internal strife and a lack of, or misunderstanding over, records ruined the Second Dynasty, 2890 to 2670 BCE. None of the Second Dynasty monarchs have reliable dates, and several of the king's names appear to be repeats of earlier rulers. Hotep II, which means two powerful ones at peace, is a prime illustration of this issue. Because of his name, it would seem that he came to power after subduing the princes who fought for the throne after Kwa, but his name is inscribed on the entrance to Kwa's tomb, implying that he was the ruler responsible for burying Kwa, and he already had that name before the succession war broke out. Hotep II is credited with bringing peace. Successor, Sennacherib I, 1971 to 1926 BCE, improved the country's infrastructure and initiated the kinds of grand building projects that had characterized the Old Kingdom and represented the king's power, including a temple to Amun at Karnak, which sparked the construction of the Great Temple complex there. Amenemhat I had followed in the footsteps of Intef II. Jehudi Necht was a nomarch of the 12th dynasty. He used to govern the 15th nome of Upper Egypt. He has a very interesting scene in his tomb of the transportation of a roughly 6.8 meter high monument of him by 172 people using ropes and a slide, in an endeavor aided by the dumping of water in front of the slide. Unfortunately, no evidence of this colossus has ever been discovered. Amenemhat III boasted of no major military triumphs. Hotep II was known as the Second Menace, who united Egypt and ushered in the Middle Kingdom period. The road to that unity was laid out by Intef I and his successors. Mentuhotep I, approximately 2115 BCE, followed Intef I's path and conquered the neighboring nomes for Thebes, considerably increasing the city's stature and strength. His initiatives were carried on by his predecessors. Mentuhotep II used these early victories to ultimately beat Heracleopolis and then punish those nomes who had stayed faithful to the old kings while rewarding those who had honored Thebes. Mentuhotep II devoted his time after the process of unity to the ruling, military accomplishments, and construction projects. Mentuhotep's successor, Mentuhotep III, reigned during 2010 to 1998 BC. Accepted as real, Sobonefru was the first woman to govern Egypt since the early dynastic period. The 12th dynasty concluded when she perished without an heir, and the 13th started with the reign of Sobekotep I, 1802 to 1800 BCE. First, a gazelle gave birth on the stone selected for the king's sarcophagus top, indicating that the stone had been chosen correctly because it was endowed with fecundity and life. Second, an unanticipated rainfall descended on the celebration, revealing a well big enough to water the entire gathering. This inscription was later interpreted to mean that Amenemhat was chosen by the gods to become king, as the gods had allowed him to experience miracles. Amenemhat I abandoned Thebes for unknown reasons and established his seat in court in Itita, governing in ancient Egypt. Den, about 2990 BCE, is regarded as the greatest monarch of the first dynasty and reigned for 50 years. His reputation as an efficient monarch stemmed from his economic advances, military conquests, and the stability of his rule, as proven by expensive construction projects and elaborate works of art. Den is the first monarch to be represented wearing the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt, showing that he ruled over a unified nation. Den was succeeded by two additional monarchs, Anegib and later Semerkhet, both of whom had tough reigns marked by insurgency. The dynasty ended with the Ka's reign, during which his heirs struggled for the throne and were defeated by Hotep Sekemui, who established the Second Dynasty, duty to protect against invasions, and had grown more acclimated to the role of traders than military men by this point. The monarchs documented for the latter portion of the 13th and 16th dynasties are non-Egyptians, or at the very least, do not have Egyptian names and are considered Hyksos rulers. Their timeline is muddled, and some names are only known from ceremonial items, while others are only known from pieces of kings' lists, making dating problematic. The Hyksos achieved economic dominance of the eastern delta and then pushed north, negotiating treaties and forging contracts with various nomarchs, governors, of other districts in Lower Egypt, until they had conquered a sizable amount of territory and could exert political authority. Once established in Avaris, the Hyksos elevated Egyptians to positions of power, adopted Egyptian customs and attire, and absorbed Egyptian deity worship into their own beliefs and ceremonies. The Hyksos monarchs established Egypt's 15th dynasty, but once they were evicted, the invading Thebans destroyed all traces of the Hyksos in Egypt. Only a few Hyksos rulers are known by name thanks to the ruins of inscriptions and other texts discovered at Avaris and elsewhere, including the best known, Apepi. Apepi was also known as Apophis, heroine in the Palestine region. Ahmose then besieged this city for 6 years until the Hyksos fled again, this time to Syria, although what happened to them after that is unknown. Ahmose I not only established the 18th dynasty, but also began the new Kingdom of Egypt, the age of the Egyptian Empire. The Hyksos were responsible for the formation of a professional Egyptian army of conquest, since Ahmose I, and those who followed him, sought to ensure that no foreign nation ever gained such dominance in their land again. The triumph that would become the new kingdom, a period of unprecedented prosperity and success in Egypt, is the legacy of the Second Intermediate Period. The 18th dynasty of Egypt, established by Ahmose I, would build some of the most renowned and memorable monuments since the Old Kingdom's pyramids.